Welcome to tonight's lecture, The London Luminaries, 14 historic organisations working together to celebrate our collective history. My name is Rachel Evans and I'm the host for this evening. I get the very great delight to welcome our fantastic chair for this evening, Professor Judith Hawley.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you to the little elves who work behind the scenes, our sous chef who prepare this feast for us. And thank you to you all for being here. It's lovely to know that we've got a live audience and also that we'll have people who'll be watching this at their leisure on our YouTube channel. Now, tonight we have a slight dating of our menu in a way. It's not that we're giving different talks, but that we've freshened up our offering. So as well as bringing you stories from the 14 historic houses who make up the London Luminaries, who are scattered around the west of London, we're also going to be bringing the past and the present together. So our talks from Strawberry Hill House tonight and from Orleans House Gallery tomorrow will be talking about recent evocations and artistic representations of food and drink, and not just the ancient world. Tonight's topic is food and drink in Gothic literature, and our speaker, who's representing Walpole's kind of fondant fancy, Strawberry Hill House, is Dr. Alessandra Pino. And she's well qualified to speak on the subject. Not only has she written a pioneering book on food in Gothic, she has worked with a Michelin-starred chef for nearly 10 years. So over to you, Alessandra.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I want to say thank you to London Luminaries and, of course, to Strawberry Hill House for this wonderful opportunity. Horace Walpole wrote The Castle of Otranto, as we all know, and it's considered the first Gothic novel. Now, let me tell you that there isn't a single shred of food in this book, no matter how many times I read it and reread it. So we'll just have to focus on other Gothic texts, I'm afraid. My name is Dr. Alessandra Pino, and I carry out research on food and the Gothic. I look at how the Gothic genre uses food as a signifier for change, and how food is more and more often connected to fear and anxiety, revealing what lies beneath the surface of cultural and social propriety. And this is quite a new topic, so bear with me. I am a co-author of a Gothic cookbook, which can be pre-ordered now, actually, and I'll give details at the end in case you would like to support or can spread the word to other Gothic literature enthusiasts as well. There are 13 chapters, and each chapter looks at a different Gothic novel and what meals there are in the text and how food is used. So central to a Gothic cookbook is the idea that food has more to offer than just being a prop or an embellishment. It actually develops its own story and can give the reader or the viewer a strong insight into the characters and the plot. Each chapter will also have recipes inspired by the meals and ingredients or food items mentioned in the novels, from Dracula, Frankenstein to Jane Eyre and The Woman in Black, for instance. So you can see for yourselves on the Unbound website, there are some sample chapters to look at and some recipes, and illustrator Lee Henry has created some really wonderful images and drawings, which I will also be showing you today during this talk. So though we'll be looking at some Gothic literature in a minute, I will start by talking first about some of the food tropes and symbols that I noticed in horror films, as this is the starting point for some of my considerations when it comes to Gothic texts and such as Frankenstein and Dracula. So we'll be talking a little bit about the following today: food as a symbol, an exploration of the meaning of food in horror supernatural films, and depictions of food in Gothic texts, such as Frankenstein, Dracula, Rebecca, The Haunting of Hill House, and Rosemary's Baby. And I'm hoping that you will have read or maybe watched the film so that I don't spoil too much for you. As well as the act of eating, I'll talk a little bit about the places that we eat in and source our food from. So the starting point for my research was from observations on how food is portrayed in film. where it often expresses a set of anxieties by acting as a signifier for change, frequently within a family setting. It started to really interest me that food and the act of eating was also tied to a series of other meanings, and these meanings were aimed at making the person watching or reading feel uneasy. So normally food had the opposite objective, that of bonding and sitting together around a table. It's a moment of union between families and friends. Food has always played the joyous role of bringing people together. When we're sitting around a table, we normally talk, we might tell some jokes or share information, and possibly we do so more freely because of the act of eating. And through nourishing ourselves, we're also nurturing the relationships that we have with the people we eat with. But what if the opposite were also true? And what if eating actually highlighted the fractures and the cracks that live under an apparently healthy veil of normality? Let's take, for example, a little look here at Annie and Paul. This is a scene from Misery. They look perfectly happy here, don't they? They're enjoying some quality time together, I think. And yet, despite this candlelit dinner setting, we know that all is not well. So here are some things that food can do. They can stress the difference between social classes. They can highlight issues of control. It can make the reader aware of vulnerabilities and relay an idea of entrapment within society and its convention. And there are, let's say, some rules that provide a cultural indication of what is appropriate and inappropriate when it comes to eating and serving food. For instance, it isn't ideal to find a tooth in your food, is it? Or an eye, perhaps. But to understand why this isn't ideal, we would need to already have an understanding of boundaries and a perception of what is right or wrong when it comes to the food rules that we follow socially. For instance, if we look at some other horror films, let's take Pizza, for instance. How is it that the pizza suddenly became a portal for devil or evil to enter into our world? We can see some examples here. The house of the devil, Lights Out, or Annabelle Comes Home. I began to notice that there was an association between an idea of disintegration of communication within the family and the community and a visual representation of a lack of food preparation or care for food as a communal experience. Because pizza is something that we eat, quite quickly, it doesn't take that much to prepare, we'll probably call for a delivery. So there isn't that much kind of bonding happening over the cooking. As a symbol, the meaning of pizza had started, in fact, to evolve into something different. And how it was being used was geared towards creating a sense of unease at first, and then fear with the appearance or manifestation of the supernatural entity. And though we all have to eat, there is an uncanniness that goes hand in hand with eating precisely because it is part of our everyday. What is outside of our bodies before it enters our body is not us. And so there is an unavoidable otherness when it comes to eating that exemplifies the uncanny. And the uncanny is defined by Freud as that which is strange in the ordinary. So in this context, the uncanny arises from the realization that there is something odd happening in perhaps the most vital of activities that we carry out to stay alive, which is eating. We engage with the outside world by placing parts of it inside ourselves, through our mouths, and for this not to feel odd, there are certain rules that we need to follow. So for us to understand, as we've said, why finding a tooth in our food isn't ideal, but even worse than that, perhaps an eye, or is it worse? An eye, we would already need to have an idea of boundaries, an idea of what's right or wrong when it comes to the food rules that we follow socially. The rules and boundaries that give food a meaning is something that British anthropologist Mary Douglas wrote about. So she states that the ingestion of food is also the consumption of a system of meanings, and she even talks of meal systems that take place over a whole life cycle. From the christening cake to the wedding cake to the funeral baked meats. We may or may not have eaten any of these, but we get the idea. And Roland Barthes, a French theorist, also famously stated that food is a system of communication, a body of images, a protocol of usages, situations, and behavior. But the communication and symbology of those items of consumption depend on the cultural context. So if we take, for instance, coffee as a symbol, it's considered a stimulant for the nervous system, but it's now associated with relaxation, which contrasts with its original function. So categories of meaning can overlap depending on the cultural context. If food is a signifier, it will also therefore represent and symbolize what is dangerous within a community and within a society. For instance, though a cake might normally symbolize a moment of celebration, perhaps a moment that people might look forward to, in this film, Get Out, directed by Jordan Peele, we see how the tension at the dinner table is actually heightened by the uncanniness of Georgina, who we see in the bottom picture, already standing behind the kitchen door, holding the cake incredibly still as the door swings open. I highly recommend this film. It's very, very scary. At other times, there is a more explicit symbology occurring, as we can see in The Possession, where Emily is vegetarian. But after she becomes possessed, she manifests a preference for eating directly from the fridge. And as we can see, is eating some raw meat. Again, going back to what Douglas and Barthes have said about food as a symbol and a system of communication, though certainly it isn't impossible to eat raw meat, in fact, it absolutely isn't, we understand that in this context, and especially because the start of the film shows her as campaigning for animal rights, we know that something is not quite right. She has been possessed and food rules have been broken. So I noticed that food or items of consumption framed supernatural events, manifestations of evil always occurring either before or after some sort of food imagery. So here we have some examples with milk, for instance. Now, milk is normally associated with purity and innocence, nutrition and growth. So it's interesting that it's so often used as a symbol closely associated to bad events taking place. And I have endless examples of something terrible happening as people open fridges. This is a time when we're most caught off guard, and intent as we are on thinking about energizing ourselves with food, it's the perfect time for something awful to happen, isn't it? So the question is, why is food a vehicle for manifestations of evil or supernatural occurrences? So I think we're increasingly worried about food, what it contains. Is what is written on the label actually what it contains, or are there hidden ingredients? What guarantee do I have as a consumer that this meat is beef and it's not horse meat, for instance? And I think that we are truly weighed down by a pressure that derives from a social responsibility to do what is right when it comes to food, how we source it, is it organic, is it healthy, is it unhealthy? The fact that food is channeling the supernatural changes that occur in horror films indicates possibly that there is an anxiety attached to this pressure. So the way that we consume has changed with capitalism in Western terms, and with it, there have been cultural changes that have seen an overlap between fear and food as spheres that intersect. And as Jane Brigson, an English cookery writer, noted in 1979, present-day dangers are no longer as visible as they used to be. Drawing a comparison with the past, she comments on food often being poisoned by unscrupulous purveyors, sand in the sugar, dried hawthorn leaves in the tea and water in the milk. But at least this was recognized as a vicious thing to do. She states that food is now knowingly adulterated and spoiled in ways that are entirely legal. So there is some anxiety over definitions regarding food we may buy. For example, the word natural. Food labeled natural, according to the USDA definition, doesn't contain artificial ingredients or preservatives, and the ingredients are only minimally processed. However, they may contain antibiotics, growth hormones, or other similar chemicals. The regulations are fairly lenient for food labeled natural. Foods are labeled traditional or artisanal, and they evoke the idea of small-scale craft food making. In actual fact, sometimes they're processed in a factory. Or fake fruits. So the picture on the front of a packet depicting healthy fruits such as strawberries or cherries belies the content, which may only have a tiny amount of that fruit or just use flavorings and coloring. So we have the illusion of all this choice, but as consumers, we are actually very vulnerable. And foods, shops and supermarkets are where we source our food, and in horror films as well, we see how they are often portrayed as a site where people take refuge, but also as a site where danger and evil may manifest itself. Food as a message can become a space of protest and distrust. And I believe that because of how the evil manifests itself in so many films nowadays, there is certainly an anxiety attached to what and how we consume that is being repeatedly expressed in this way. So there's a lot going on when it comes to the meaning of food in the context of horror. And with that in mind, when I reread some Gothic literature, I was able to notice some food rules or patterns of consumption that I hadn't noticed before. And this is how a Gothic cookbook began. One of the chapters that we have is inspired by Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, and it was a novel written in 1817, published in 1823, one of the first Gothic texts in which it's possible to observe how food acts as a symbol for what is other in the context of societal change, and this is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So the late 18th century was a period of time where the modalities of food production were changing and where the Industrial Revolution had begun transforming economies that had been previously based on agriculture and handicrafts into economies based on large-scale industry, mechanized manufacturing, and the factory system. So with the Romantics, we have a return to favoring a closer communion with nature, and Romantic radicalism provided the context for vegetarianism, to which Mary Shelley was exposed to while growing up. Most of the Romantic vegetarians saw the French Revolution as an opportunity to reform the world along with eliminating meat eating. And the first British book of this time to champion vegetarianism was John Oswald's The Cry of Nature, or An Appeal to Mercy and to Justice on behalf of the persecuted animals, which was published in 1791. And he actually died in France in 1793, fighting for the Jacobins during the French Revolution. And I think the first vegetarian cookbook was published around this time too. In the words of Percy Shelley, it is only the wealthy that can, to any degree, even now, indulge the unnatural craving for dead flesh. And he writes this in A Vindication of Natural Diet. The scholarship hasn't overly focused on the Frankenstein's creature's vegetarianism, but generally the idea is that Frankenstein's monster, being vegetarian, symbolically stands for an original benevolence. The creature includes animals within its moral codes, but is obstructed and violently frustrated when attempting to regain inclusion within the moral codes of humanity. It proposes the creation of a companion so that it need no longer seek inclusion in human society. And it is at this point that it announces its dietary principles and those that its companion will follow when they accept self-imposed exile to South America. My food is not that of man, it says. I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment. My companion will be of the same nature as myself and will be content with the same fare. We shall make our bed of dried leaves, and the sun will shine on us as on man and will ripen our food. The picture I present to you is peaceful and human. So vegetarianism is one way that the creature marks the difference and separation from its creator by placing the emphasis on its more inclusive moral code. And its vegetarianism also serves to make it a more sympathetic being who considers how humans exploit others. By including animals within its moral world, the creature provokes a symbol for what it hoped for and needed, but did not receive from human society. So there is a humanization through food of Frankenstein's being. He is monstrous in the Latin sense of the word, which means to show. And what is it showing us? Perhaps that he isn't a born killer and his murders are a consequence of a lack of nurture. His innocence is proved or made evident by his food choices. And interestingly, the monster decides to eat fruit and nuts in order to spare the family he observes in the wilderness from hunger, as he recognizes that he's not equal to man and therefore does not deserve to eat better food, i.e. other animals. Thus, a discrepancy is created between who is the most human between both, the creator who brings to life a being who didn't ask to be brought to life and abandons him, or a monster, who though cast aside is able to sacrifice himself by eating foods that nourish him less in order to comply with the social rules that see him subjugated to a society that has both created him and cast him aside. And leading on from this human versus monster, and I wonder what your favorite monsters are, because there are so many different kinds. I think we come here to the kind of, yeah, head of the clan of monsters, who vampires seem to always be leading this monstrous team. Werewolves and, you know, others don't seem to quite compete with how vampires are seen as, and Dracula is a #1 vampire, I think, and by Bram Stoker, 1897. And actually, Dracula starts off with references to food from page 1. Jonathan Harker, as he embarks on his journey and he moves further and further away from the west towards the east and into the territories of the former Ottoman Empire, we see how the food also gets more pungent and wilder, and strangeness starts turning into superstition. And before he reaches Dracula's castle, Jonathan is eating meals on a regular basis. So we can see from his supper, his breakfast and his dinners, and he takes the time to describe them. So they were able to see him eat normally with a consistency and a structure in his meals. The local cuisine is providing him in the meantime with large amounts of garlic, but of course Harker has no idea of the significance of this at this stage. He says, "We left in pretty good time and came after nightfall to Klausenberg, and here I stopped for the night at the Hotel Royal. I had for dinner, or rather supper, a chicken done up some way with red pepper, which was very good but thirsty. Get recipe for Mina. I asked the waiter and he said it was called paprika hendel, and that as it was a national dish, I should be able to get it anywhere along the Carpathians." This is a dish also included in a Gothic cookbook, by the way. But by the time that Harker arrives at the castle and is greeted by Count Dracula, he's already scared, as are the readers, I think. He has been prepared by the food, causing him strange dreams and a strangeness of origin attached to and initially generated by the food. Now, Dracula was written in 1897, and during the late 19th century, exported goods from the colonies became widely available to purchase in Britain. And in the parallel Gothic literary scene, vampires became a symbol of the transformation that reflected these changes happening in the world. Bram Stoker's Dracula is an example of the fear of the unknown and the other, and could be parallel to the new products that were being imported to Britain's expansion as a colonial power. As Gothic monsters, vampires are essentially characterized by the idea of transformation and insatiable hunger, and Stoker interlaces the deepest instincts and fears about identity through hunger and food to create this monstrous picture of otherness. So food-wise, a sense of danger is conveyed by the transition from availability of food before Harker reaches the castle and unavailability of food in Dracula's castle. So there is a mention of cold food that Jonathan eats alone, obviously. Cold breakfasts are laid out, and they become less and less descriptive as his stay in the castle continues. Though Dracula does make sure to have gold table service, and of course, he thoroughly enjoys the flourish of taking the cover of the dish off these cold cuts himself for Harker. And this excessive formality also contributes to a sense of uneasiness, as it feels as though the gesture is due to an overcompensation because of the lack of more adequate food. This formality, but displayed in the context of hierarchy, is also present and visible in Rebecca, one of my favorite novels on a personal note, written in 1938 by Daphne du Maurier. So the world of Rebecca is one of inflexible social hierarchies, with the theme of food acting as the pivot upon which social distinctions are made. Throughout the novel, characters eat according to who they are and where they stand in the class system. And in the opening pages, I'll call her unnamed heroine. It's a bit awkward because she's the second Mrs. de Winter. We don't know her name. I call her Rebecca mistakenly a number of times, but let's say that she's our unnamed heroine. So unnamed heroine's employer, Mrs. Van Hopper, enjoys fresh ravioli, while unnamed heroine is reduced to eating cold meat. So we see the distinction here. And there are lots of remakes. I think there's a recent remake of Rebecca, so you might have seen the series or the film quite recently as well. Mrs. Van Hopper, her fat, bejeweled fingers questing a plate heaped high with ravioli, and her eyes darting suspiciously from her plate to mine for fear I should have made the better choice. She need not have disturbed herself, for the waiter, with the uncanny swiftness of his kind, had long sensed my position as inferior and subservient to hers, and had placed before me a plate of ham and tongue that somebody has sent back to the cold buffet half an hour before as badly carved. So here we see the sense of class and how that makes a difference in who eats what. Once she becomes the second Mrs. de Winter, this hierarchical attitude manifested through food will also be echoed by how the terrifying Mrs. Danvers, the head housekeeper at Manderley, treats her and approaches her daily with a selection of menus that she needs to choose from as lady of the house. But she never has the courage to do this and to make her own individual choices. She always ends up choosing what Rebecca would have chosen according to Mrs. Danvers' suggestions. Now, Manderley, this big old house, is open to the public and to visitors, and our second Mrs. de Winter's role is also to welcome them, which she does so half-heartedly. In fact, more often, she describes these moments as stripping the peace from their day, and we have this reflection of unease and unhappiness through how tea time is described in this instance, not as she would like it under the chestnut tree, slightly removed from the house itself, but as a dreary affair. She talks about the monstrosity of the teapot and the kettle they mirror these feelings of inadequacy when it comes to serving and making conversation with the visitors. And taking this a step further, I would say that the ritual of tea time is presented really as an attack. So she feels repeatedly attacked by the food conventions, the food rules and strict timings surrounding food at Manderley that quite often make her lose her appetite. In fact, she says of the tea ritual that Frith came into the room, followed by Robert, they are the servants, and the ritual of our tea began. The performance of the day before was repeated, the placing of the table, the laying of the snow-white cloth, the putting down of cakes and crumpets, the silver kettle of hot water placed on its little flame, while Jasper, wagging his tail, his ears stretched back in anticipation, watched my face. I took a piece of crumpet, divided it between the two dogs. I did not want it myself. I was not hungry. My fingers were messy with the butter from the crumpet, and I felt in my pocket for a handkerchief. This is an image taken from a Gothic cookbook by Lee Henry. We see a selection of cakes. I would not hold back, so well done, Beth. Later on in the novel, Mrs. de Winter will reject cold food and leftovers as a daily lunch in Manderley, and her insistence upon a hot lunch from the servants is, from her point of view, a triumph and a symbol of her status as the Mrs. de Winter. And she says, it was going to be very different in the future. I was not going to be nervous and shy with the servants anymore. I would go and interview the cook in the kitchen, and they would like me and respect me. Soon it would be as though Mrs. Danvers had never had command. Manderley in flames at the end, I think, signifies the end of an era. So when our heroine of inferior class starts giving orders to people who aren't below her social standing, she exerts her authority within the same sphere in which she feels she has been humiliated. So through food. Often there are houses burning at the end of these novels. Really, it's like the house's size or the requirements is what makes it necessary to have so many servants. So there is a need to metaphorically kill off an aristocratic past, which goes hand in hand with the destruction of the house itself. And from one rebellious house to another one, this is another novel that we've included in a Gothic cookbook, and it is The Haunting of Hill House. Also a recent series on Netflix, so they're all coming back. That one is particularly scary, actually, I found. The Haunting of Hill House follows 4 strangers, all of whom come to Hill House, long rumoured to be haunted, under the guidance of Dr. Montague, who's hoping to scientifically prove the existence of the supernatural over the course of the summer. The house proves itself to be extremely haunted, and how it does so is expressed through the way in which consumption occurs, of course, from my point of view. So my focus here was mainly on Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper of Hill House, another very creepy housekeeper. She's a really fascinating character, actually, who we mainly find in the kitchen, cooking, preparing things. So Mrs. Dudley repeats on many occasions that she leaves the house before it gets dark. In fact, she doesn't stay after she sets out dinner. Theodora and Eleanor pick up a certain nervousness attached to Mrs. Dudley, when it comes to the house and the fact that they need to respect timings surrounding meals. She's very strict about that. So they notice that there are an odd number of doors in the kitchen, gesturing to the fact that Mrs. Dudley might need multiple escape routes for some reason. In fact, Eleanor says, our good Mrs. Dudley likes doors, doesn't she? She can certainly get out fast in any direction if she wants to. I wonder if she had Dudley cut extra doors for her. I wonder how she likes working in a kitchen where a door in back of her might open without her knowing it. I wonder actually just what Mrs. Dudley is in the habit of meeting in her kitchen, so that she wants to make sure that she'll find a way out no matter which direction she runs. Now, there are a few references to how Mrs. Dudley may or may not be working for Dracula throughout the book, and Theodora and Eleanor discuss whether Mrs. Dudley is actually watching over them for Dracula, who might be located in the house, since they have noticed bats in the house itself. And at one point, Theodora starts feeling as if she were walking up the walls, which also leads us back to this Dracula imagery. So we start to maybe get the feeling that Mrs. Dudley is feeding them in order to then feed the house. Food and its mechanical timings are used to lull the guests into a false sense of security. And I think when the guests notice their own feelings, when it comes to identifying what this haunting entity wants them to note, then it's actually to consume us, to take us into itself and make us part of the house, maybe. Oh dear, says Eleanor. And Eleanor also does mention that she feels like a small creature swallowed whole by a monster. And she thought, and the monster feels my tiny little movements inside. So yes, this idea of feeding them to then feed them to the house. And we see that the house here is presented in a way as a maternal space that regenerates itself through the guests who are being fed within its walls and within its belly, possibly, or body. And this leads the way to a maternity of a special kind. This is the last novel we're looking at, also included in a Gothic cookbook, of course, and it is one of my favorites, Rosemary's Baby. And this novel gives me the opportunity to discuss some issues of trust and food. So the book centers on Rosemary Woodhouse, a young married woman who's just moved into a New York City apartment building with her husband, Guy, who is a struggling actor. Now, Rosemary and Guy have a picnic of tuna sandwiches and a beer, as we can see in their new apartment, and an initial air of normality is established in this way, because when people eat on the floor, apparently it's a good thing in films, it's romantic. I mean, I don't know, I wouldn't prefer it, but there we are. The neighbor, Minnie, makes frequent appearances with food and drink, for instance, chocolate mousse, and we begin to gain some more insight into Rosemary and Guy's relationship from this point on. So Rosemary complains that her mousse has a chalky undertaste and only has 2 spoonfuls, while Guy makes a scene and basically forces her to finish it. So with Guy's insistence, we can really see the relationship isn't a healthy one. In fact, Rosemary asks the question, could anyone know when an actor was true and not acting? And this sets the tone for the food scenes too. She realizes that she can't trust the food and that she's being given, and that she realizes that she's being poisoned within the walls of her own home. That same night, she eats the mousse, and Rosemary has a dream that she is being possessed by something inhuman, following which she starts to eat glutton meals, man-sized cans of beef stew and other meats even. So when Rosemary discovers that she's pregnant, Minnie is one of the first people to congratulate her, and it is decided that all the grocery shopping will be done for her, indicating that the points of entrance in terms of controlling Rosemary are mainly through consumption. So here we are. I thought I'd include one of our recipes that you'll find in a Gothic cookbook. This is a picture of our mousses. And this is an illustration of them by Lee Henry. I hope this brief overview of food and the Gothic has been interesting. Here are some texts as well for some further reading. My aim today has been to talk about how food can act as a secret subtext that can open the window of interpretation a little bit wider when it comes to the Gothic. And a Gothic cookbook with recipes inspired by these novels aims to offer a different perspective when it comes to what food can mean. So thank you very much. Thanks again.
Many thanks indeed, Ali, for your amazing talk. I'll certainly be ordering a copy of that cookbook myself. If this talk has whetted your appetite for more in the series, you'll see that we have 4 more talks in our first course, and some of these will be returning more to the more directly to the historical and to the connection with the house. And we have a second course, if you'll show us the slide now, please, Ali, where we'll be really ranging very widely from the past of the medieval estate in Gunnersbury to the present, to posh nosh and kitchen gardens. And if this series has interested you in the houses and what they have to offer you, and you're interested in volunteering, do please follow the link here to Strawberry Hill House volunteers. Thank you so much.